Hello there and welcome to the channel, or welcome back if you're one of my regular viewers. I'm sorry it's been so long since the last update, but I've been moving flats. As you can see, this setup here is for acoustic reasons. It's been sounding kind of echoey. If the sound quality is really bad, please do leave a comment. I have a pretty low threshold for this kind of thing. So it's like unlistenable, let me know and I'll try and change up in the future. But I've been moving flats, looking for a new job, and we've been opening up out of lockdown here in Wales, which means the social events have all got kind of bottlenecked. But I'm back now. Please do stay subscribed. I should be releasing weekly or fortnightly, and it does cost nothing to stay subscribed. And on my subscribers, thank you very much to anyone that's left a message for me while I've been away. It's really encouraging knowing that people enjoy the content, and it's really helped me get back into the swing of things now. So hopefully everything will be a bit more regular. But let's get right down to it. So this is going to be, I guess, the first episode of season 2. Something a little different. This is an analysis of a video put out by Owen Jones, the prominent left-wing British journalist, activist type person, which was a 3-person discussion, not a debate. These people agree throughout. Their video was on the topic of incel culture and how it relates to a recent mass shooting here in Britain. Essentially what they're trying to argue is that we should treat incels like terrorists. I think there's a claim that's pretty out there, so I'm going to analyse what it is they're saying and see how they get to that conclusion. I don't really have a sort of one central key point, other than it's really sloppy thinking throughout their video, and I want to identify certain parts of it to illustrate that. But it is a good introduction to Owen Jones. If you don't know him, he's a fascinating figure, and I will draw out several learning experiences throughout the analysis. I think the video I'll be looking at is really emblematic of a lot of problems of political discourse now, especially online. It can come from the left or right, but it's just all talk, saying nothing. Nothing is properly justified or argued for at all. Even when the claims are really far out there and you think like they need a lot of work to be put in, they just don't bother. This is likely going to follow my usual pattern of a 2-part video, each about 10 or 15 minutes. Part 1, we're going to look at the background. I'm going to tell you who Owen Jones is. If you don't know, lucky you. Then we're going to go on to look at the tragic events of the shooting in Plymouth. So trigger warning there for violence and for sexual assault content throughout. All very abstract. I'm not going into detail on anything, but just so you're aware. Then we're going to look at how Owen Jones and his 2 guests on the show try to link this into the broader phenomenon of incel culture. Then in part 2, we're going to look at the practical solutions they suggest or don't suggest for dealing with the problems that they've identified. And then I'm going to do the fun part and have a little dig around in Owen Jones' psyche and see why it is exactly that he's so upset with the incels and wants to see them branded terrorists. And I'll summarize it all together and do a little future of the channel thing as well at the end of the next video. So with that all out the way, let's get started. So Owen Jones is the most important figure here. I'm probably going to talk more about the 2 guests throughout the 2 videos just because he's interviewing them, so they do most of the answering. But it's important to note that he never disagrees with anything they're saying, and it's all hosted on his channel, so I assume he avows it all to some extent. Owen Jones has been around for a while now. He's probably the most prominent socialist, if not just left-wing, commentary figure, talking head in Britain. He was a massive supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, and he's always very heavily identified himself with the Labour Party. So like even when he criticises the Labour Party and thinks they're going wrong, it's very clear that his mission is always to fix it and get it back on track. Because what he wants is a Labour Party victory, essentially. It's sort of like a weird brand loyalty thing. I'm trying to be neutral in my description here. He is a journalist. He writes articles for The Guardian. He doesn't seem to do much investigative journalism. It's more opinion pieces. But he's also a writer. He's written several, proper books, academic books about politics. I've read one. It's pretty good. He is a legitimate thinker. But I feel like nowadays he's probably known for being more of a Twitter reactionary and sort of troll bait kind of guy, basically. Throughout his career, Owen Jones has been consistently economically socialist and socially progressive. I wouldn't say that he's biased because, I don't like talking about journalists in that way. Everyone has their, points of view that they're going to be writing from. But with Owen Jones in particular, it's very clear that everything he does is to further one of those 2 causes, either economic socialism or social progressivism, or both. If it isn't doing one of those 2 things, Owen Jones has no interest in it as a topic. His 2 guests are Dr. Maria Norris. Her doctorate is in European Studies, and she's worked on several academic bodies across Europe dealing with terrorism. And Sian Norris, no relation to her, who is a journalist at Byline Times, which as far as I can tell is like a purely online feminist-focused magazine. So those two have been called in as experts because Sean Norris writes a lot on incel culture and Maria Norris is an expert in terrorism. And like I say, the entire point of that video seems to be to establish a link between incels and terrorism. And I just want to make the point early on that like these are three, major, well, Owen Jones is a major figure in the British commentariat, but they're all people to be taken seriously. Like Maria Norris is clearly an established academic. Sean Norris is a journalist. They're all working people. They all contribute to this society. And here they are having a serious discussion on incels, which to me, like several years ago, was just an online insult. But now apparently it's a major sociological problem. So let's find out why. So just to give you a quick recap of the shooting, no jokes or funny stuff in this part, unfortunately, but we do need to get through it. Jake Davidson, on the 12th of August this year, got into a domestic argument with his mother, who he then shot and killed. He then went on a shooting rampage, essentially the biggest Britain has seen in 10 years. Killed a 3-year-old girl and her father, shot and wounded and killed several other people as well, and then killed himself. Owen Jones streamed his video, his discussion, 3 days later on the 15th of August, and admits himself they didn't have all the facts out at the time. I don't think any relevant facts have really come to light since then, but there are a lot of interesting facts in the case, such as the fact that Jake Davidson had been warned for aggressive behavior before. He attacked a pregnant woman. At that point, he had his gun and his gun license taken away from him. Then he completed an anger management course and the gun was given back. His mother had been begging the social services basically for help with his mental health. Obviously, he was aggressive. He was putting videos on YouTube, lots of which linked to incel culture, and he was involved in a lot of those kind of subreddits in that kind of world. But primarily, it's just important to note here that the police do not have a motive for the killings. They're not sure what the domestic argument with his mother was about specifically. And also that there are a number of things that you might consider causal factors there. So like things that caused the shooting to happen. And I guess we can say they're important causal factors if their removal would have meant that the shooting never happened. So some of my American viewers might be surprised to learn that the discussion over here has not been about gun control at all. People on the left are generally pretty happy with gun control measures in Britain as they are. They accept that things like this will happen from time to time. So to them, that's not an important causal factor, even though it's pretty clearly obvious that if he didn't have the gun, he wouldn't have been able to do the shooting. The causal factor Owen Jones and his two friends here want to focus on is the incel aspect. They think that it's incel culture that caused the shooting and that we should do something about incel culture pretty soon or this kind of shooting will happen again. That's the essential thrust of their video, so let's look at how they argue for that and how they justify that. So the first thing we're going to do here is the first thing you should do at the start of every serious discussion like this, and that's look at the key terms, in particular incels. Owen Jones gave me a lot of hope when his video was entitled "Who Are the Incels?" because you think it would be all sort of working out your definitions, right? Figuring out what the incels are. Not so. Owen Jones doesn't really address the question directly. He asks his panelists about it at the beginning, and Maria Norris says they're defined by a feeling of entitlement to women and sex. So they are men that can't get laid, but they feel like they should be getting laid, like society or women owe them that. And Sean Norris defines them as male supremacists. They are people that want to take away women's rights. So one important thing to make clear is that they don't seem to be using the term incel literally. They don't seem to mean just any person that wants to have sex and is unable to. I think even they're aware that would be a bit mean to pick on people like that. I'm being a little bit charitable here because they don't spell any of this out in their own video, but I'm assuming that they don't have a problem with just people that can't have sex. I'm assuming that what the people that have a problem with are like the sort of aggressively misogynistic people that mostly sort of exist online that have a problem with women's rights. So it's basically men who are aggressively anti-feminist. That's what they're talking about when they say incel. So to keep things simple, that's how I'll use the term incel in this video. I don't mean a person that is involuntarily celibate. I mean a person that is aggressively against women while also still being like straight and sort of wanting that traditional wife type thing. You guys basically know what I mean by incels, but it's important to get the terms correct since they don't really bother with it. Point being, I imagine they're going to have a problem with an incel who is very sexually successful, right? Like the person's having sex or not isn't actually relevant to the discussion. It's their views. So we are going after a group of people, the incels, who are united by particular views on sex and gender. So if their goal, their conclusion, is to try and convince you that we should treat incels like terrorists, and it is, then the first thing they need to do is clearly define who the incels are, which they fail to do, and the next thing they need to do is show you why the incels are a problem. And in this case, they're relying on the shooting we talked about, the Jake Davidson shooting. They think that was a result of incel culture, and so something needs to be done. But to be clear on this, like, Jake Davidson isn't an Elliot Rodger type. He didn't put out a manifesto saying, here's what I'm going to do, here's why I'm going to do it, so we all know why it was done. He had an argument with his mother, that turned violent, and then he killed several other people. I mean, there's obviously a mental health issue. I mean, you don't kill random people unless you have a mental health issue. But I mean, like, he was walking up and down the street. Someone said to at one point, like, you know, what the hell is going on? He was like, oh, it's all fine, mate, don't worry. Like, he clearly was not in a good frame of mind, and that might have had nothing to do at all with him being an incel. All of this really exemplifies what a lot of people talk about when they talk about media narratives versus facts. Like, there are a lot of facts here, like the fact he had the gun taken away and given back. The fact that his mother wanted more mental health support for him and wasn't getting it. The fact, sure, that he had all these incel videos online. Like, there's a number of narratives you could have gone with here. But Owen Jones wants to focus on the incel narrative, and the paper he works for, The Guardian, also wants to focus on that narrative. So while there's no disagreement about facts, like I and Owen Jones don't disagree on the facts of the case at all, I assume, there is a disagreement over narrative. Because Owen Jones's causal narrative is incel leads to shooting, and that's bad. Whereas you could easily craft a narrative about gun control over this, or police supervision over this, right? I mean, like, you could pluck a few things out of the air to make this a narrative about. I mean, you could look into his history with video games if you wanted to and see, ooh, did he play lots of violent video games? Was that a causal factor? To solve these issues, what Owen Jones needs to do is provide a compelling case or argument for his narrative. We all agree on the facts, but why that narrative? But instead, Owen Jones just never does that, nor do either of his guests. They just tell you again and again and again that that's the narrative. He was an incel. Other incels have caused violence too, and this is just a massive worldwide problem, and the only solution is to treat them as terrorists. This mostly takes the form of his two guests telling us over and over again that incel culture links to certain other things. So there are links to far-right culture, and links to memes, and links to white supremacy, and links to the Charlottesville rally where a woman got killed because the driver yelled an incel phrase. It links to BLM, it links to the murder of Sarah Everard, which was last year here in Britain, I think last year, maybe earlier this year, and it links to the way that police closed down her vigil. It all links to all these nasty, nasty things, but none of the links are explored in any depth. None of it is substantial. We're just told that's the case because they want you to start thinking of bad things when you think of incels, and that is what they think will justify the case as treating incels as terrorists. The fact that, well, nobody likes incels and they might be violent, right? There's no actual attempt to justify that case. The video is purely an attempt to put you in a certain emotive state so that when people talk about incels, you think bad people. I'm quite sure that a lot of the incels are bad people if they're aggressively misogynistic, but the problem is that by definition, aggressively misogynistic is all they are. They're not necessarily violent, and that's the key premise that Owen Jones needs to complete his argument, and he just lacks it. So we hear all sorts of crazy things. I'll just list some of them here. So Sean Norris says that this links to great replacement theory, which doesn't say how many incels believe in great replacement theory, or vice versa. It's just a link. Sean Norris says that there's been a lot of research that shows that incel culture is a gateway drug to white supremacy, but we get no link to that research. She doesn't provide any data or facts to back that up, but it's just a link that's there. Incels kind of equal white supremacists, really, same sort of thing. No evidence, by the way, Jake Davidson was racist in any way. By the end of the video, we're discussing anti-abortion laws in Hungary and anti-LGBT laws in Poland. This is all somehow linked. And it is unfortunately mostly a problem with the left. This very just amorphous way of treating society, which is like, there's the good things, the progressive things, like feminism and anti-racism, and those are against the forces of evil, like misogyny and racism, and all of either side are linked, so that if you find one problem, you probably found about 10, because if you find out someone's an incel, that probably also means they're a conspiracy theorist, good grief, and a white supremacist, and a potential murderer, and all these other negative things. So let's be super charitable here and try to break down what they're saying into syllogism, into premises and conclusions, so we can see exactly what's wrong with the logic. So here's the gist of what they're saying. Premise 1 is that Jake Davidson was an incel. Premise 2 is that Jake Davidson was violent. And the conclusion is that incels are violent. Now, the reason this doesn't work, the reason they don't explain their argument in detail, because they know it doesn't work as an argument, is that it's what you call an induction from one. So an induction is when you use evidence you've acquired to make assumptions about things you don't know about yet. So for example, I might see 100 swans and I might use induction to figure that all swans are white. I would in fact be wrong in that case because some swans, it turns out, are black, right? Induction from one is obviously the lowest amount of evidence you can have, right? Jake Davidson was a violent incel is only one case. You could just easily say, well, did he have brown hair? I guess people with brown hair are violent then, right? Like, if you have an example of one cat, you've only ever met one cat in your life, and it happened to have 3 legs, it's an unwise induction to just say, well, all cats have 3 legs, because you're only working off one case. And even if we pile in all the other examples of violent incels, and I think they only give one other one, which is the Charlottesville guy, well, and Elliot Rogers, that's 3, then that's still only an induction for 3, and you're treating, potentially hundreds, thousands of people like that. And what you're asking is for people to be prejudiced, essentially. You're asking them to say, well, okay, we only have a small sample number of violent incels, but we'd really like you to treat all incels like that, because, we can't be too careful when it comes to violence. So that's really the summary of part 1 then. What we have is just this very messy discourse where they're obviously trying to establish a link between incels and violence, but they don't tell you what an incel really is, and then their argument for their link is just so poor. Like, they don't explain anything in any way. It's all just information being thrown at you with just sort of buzzwords thrown in, like, oh, BLM, oh, a lot of these people are anti-BLM, a lot of the incels don't like BLM, ooh, a lot of them believe in great replacement theory, that's scary. It's all just an effort to emotionally manipulate you with no underlying logic. Like, the underlying logic is terrible. It is so flawed. And you might be thinking sort of, what is the gist of this video? Well, in part 2, I'm going to cover how they try and use those previous terrible arguments to support treating incels like terrorists, right? And I don't just mean hunting down certain people that are incels and treating them like terrorists. I mean watching everybody online or offline, just in society, more, so you can get a handle on their behavior and, do the sort of precog thing of stopping violence before it even happens, which of course would be an erosion of everyone's civil liberties. It's also a good example of how Owen Jones, at least, and a lot of British commentators operate. There's just no logic, no argumentation. If you watch one of their videos and you don't already agree with what it is they're saying, there's no effort to logically persuade you to say, well, what I'm saying is true because of X, Y, and Z. They never do that. It's all just social shaming and appeals to emotion and just no substance. Not like this video, which is a hard-going critique of exactly what is being said and exactly what's wrong with it. So more of that to come in part 2, where we'll look at their proposed practical solutions, why they don't work. We'll address the ever-important question of whether or not Owen Jones is a cuck, and we'll summarize and wrap up, and then I'll tell you what's happening with the future of the channel. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Leave a like if you liked it, share with a friend if you think they'd like it, and leave a comment down below if you've got anything to add. If you'd like to complain about the sound, go ahead and do that, and I'll try and sort something out for next time. And thank you again for everyone who helped to comment during the break. That was really helpful for you guys. Till then, I've been Dr. Tom Pepper, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.